Hello, my name is Brendan Hogan. I am presenting my thesis on the growing hate, the vice, racist hate speech, and key events influencing the white nationalist movement in the United States since 2007. My advisors for this thesis, with a special shout out to them, were Professor Heather Baddeley and Michael Morrell in the Department of Philosophy and Political Science, respectively. This project takes on a specific focus towards white nationalism based on the Southern Poverty Law Center's definition of white nationalist groups. They consider these organizations as groups that espouse white supremacist or white separatist ideologies, often focusing on the alleged inferiority of non-whites. These groups have included the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi organizations, and racist skinhead associations. In the US, there has been a specific rise in the white nationalistic ideals in organizations. From 2000 to 2019, there was a 131% increase in US white nationalist hate groups, where this number rose from 67 to 155 in that respective time period. Groups in this group categorization have included and do include American Renaissance, American Identity Movement, the Council of Conservative Citizens, American Patriots USA, and Vidar Foundation. What's particularly important about this movement and relatively concerning is that they have shifted to online communications where they have allowed or been able to interact with others in online blogs, forums, and websites. This has allowed them to maintain social bonds with other members, attract members nationally, and prepare for rallies. This has been underscored by the fact that David Duke, the creator of the KKK's offshoot group, Knights of the KKK, to state the internet is the greatest ever opportunity to spread racist ideologies. Despite this growth, there has not been much research studying their internet use. So that's where this thesis research came in. It specifically relies on two theories, the first being political backlash theory. Political backlash is considered to be a reaction of anger or annoyance to changes in societal structures that impacts one's social status. Essentially, individuals may push back against changes due to anxiety that pervasive cultural changes and an influx of foreigners are eroding the cultural norms one knew since childhood. It is in this instance that we connect it to white nationalism from the standpoint that it's a threatening reality for some white nationalists. The threat that white nationalist individuals feel essentially guilty and stressed that their experience when they're told social status, economic advantages, and political behaviors are deriving from, at least partly, and sustained by a systemic racial inequalities. And it's this essential claim and point that white nationalists may strongly oppose and even feel threatened by. And alongside these points, they are also threatened by social movements like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, and other politically and socially important events. And they may believe that to preserve a white majority in the US and prevent this change, they must counteract these movements and any diversification efforts. And it is in this essential theory that I directed my thesis towards, as it may have essentially been able to explain the rise in support for white nationalism as threatening reality for other white individuals increases, they may feel more inclined to join one of these groups. Alongside the political backlash theory, there's also the individual factors of the intellectual humility and the vice of arrogance. Looking at the philosophical component here, you look specifically at intellectual humility as a recognition, or generally a recognition, that one's views may be wrong, and um, essentially this same individual provides a consistent effort to acknowledge and fix one's limitations. On the flip side to this virtue, there's the vice of arrogance, corresponding vice. That there's a tendency for an individual with this vice to overlook other perspectives, disregard personal limitations, and assume one's views are right. Out of a protection for one's arrogant self assessment and perceived superiority, an arrogant individual may become angry or disrespect other viewpoints. Considering all this in the white nationalist movement, applying it to that movement specifically, Leaders may display larger levels of arrogance in their rhetoric after certain political and social events tied to topics of diversity, equality, and inclusion. They may produce more arrogant rhetoric alongside their anger and hate, and essentially their backlash against certain social movements. They may feel that their views are being challenged, and they become like more hardened and less likely to consider all other viewpoints and believe their own viewpoints are right all the time or a majority of the time. If they overlook their flaws in their arguments and viewpoints and overemphasize their strengths, this theory essentially points to a claim that they may be hard to argue against in political debates. They may downplay claims that they are wrong when faced with overwhelming counter evidence. It is this second theory in my thesis that was a contribution to looking at the white nationalist movement. Combining those two components, political backlash theory and the vice of arrogance component, this thesis looked at a hybrid approach, through a hybrid approach, the content white nationalist leaders' public blogs, and related that specific content to the larger socially and politically important events behind the time period or alongside the time period of when those blogs were being produced. The ultimate research question is what political events and individual factors have contributed to the growing white nationalism movement in the United States since 2007. Thus, I've derived three hypotheses, one being the growth of white nationalism can be explained by white nationalist backlash against key events of social and political importance within the US. And two, as white nationalist groups backlash towards these important political events increases, white national leaders will increasingly use explicitly racist and or hateful political rhetoric in their blogs. And then three, as white nationalist groups backlash towards these important political events increases, white nationalist leaders will increasingly display the vice of arrogance in their rhetoric. The overall research design of this project considered three prominent leaders, Kevin Deanna, Jared Taylor, and Rocky Shoyeda, and looked at around 200 blogs per leader. These blogs were uncensored persuasion, where essentially these leaders could argue however they wanted and talk about topics on their own terms without being edited or considered to be vetted for political correctness. So it was essentially their own viewpoints inspired by their own reactions to certain events. And they were publicly accessible. So a pro of using blogs was that they weren't behind any paywalls. You didn't have to pay for any books to access them. And then also, unlike other websites online that don't necessarily have certain timestamps or dates of when they were produced, these blogs were accessible in a reverse chronological order, where we could track alongside a timeline how these blogs were produced or when these blogs were produced. Looking at these three leaders, their viewpoints were generally representative of their group as a whole and what they believed as prominent leaders within their individual groups. They generally represent what their group is believing in or essentially arguing for at the time period. The project also had a quantitative content analysis using the linguistic inquiry word count software program. This was an efficient and objective way to study the trends in words used by the leaders in their 600 in the total 600 blogs since 2007, and it allowed a frequency count of words, and it was reliable compared to hand coders that would not necessarily be as reliable. A software program was able to consistently count the words and track certain words throughout the blocks relatively efficiently too. Second component was a qualitative analysis of notable political events tied to racial justice movements since 2007. These events were playing out as these leaders were writing these blogs, and they included the Tea Party movement, the death of Trayvon Martin, election of Obama, the Charleston church shooting, and the election of Donald Trump. 2007 was the start date, and it went till 2020, specifically the timeline of when I was looking at these blogs. And 2007 was chosen specifically because of the early signs of the major economic recession in a contentious election cycle that would end in the first African American US president. So, relatively for a recent year, it was a relatively important year for social and political reasons. Now, looking at Kevin DeYanno, who's the founder of the white nationalist group Youth for Western Civilization, wrote almost 2,000 articles for white nationalist blogs, considered to be ground zero for the formation of the alt-right's more intellectual wing. And this was essentially a main reason why I chose Kevin, because he was looking specifically or writing specifically for these blogs or these websites that were considered to be a center for the intellectual community when this within the white nationalist movement. Rocky Shoeda was the chairman of the American Nazi Party, and he essentially revived the party originally founded by George Lincoln Rockwell in 1960. He had gained publicity for his outright disdain for the Jewish Americans and devotion to Hitler, and even supported um, the election of Donald Trump because he believed it would uphold white nationalist views. Jared Taylor was the founder and editor of the 30-year-old magazine and website American Renaissance. This website is actually hosted around 150 to 200 separate alt-right or white nationalist individuals, and other individuals outside of the white nationalist movement have spewed hate speech and racist dialogue. Jared Taylor has used pseudoscience to write about eugenics, race, and intelligence alongside appeals to have a white dominated society. He has also planned and hosted annual conferences for the website to connect his followers with white supremacists, American Nazis, and the KKK. Um, Thus, he was also another leader to consider as a relatively important figure in the white nationalist movement. Tracking backlash through hate speech, to actually look at the backlash and consider its effects or its presence in blogs. I looked at the current events and social movements um, as essentially leading to hate or anger within these leaders. These leaders were going to express anger or a reaction to these movements and specifically reflecting their fear of losing white identity, white privileges, and white superiority as they saw certain things like immigration to the US and diversity within the US population rise. To track the backlash, I look specifically at explicitly racist, hateful, and divisive political rhetoric and words that were essentially deemed to be a reaction to these events. And that it was essentially the method to track the backlash, this backlash of anger, this reaction to these events. They included racial slurs, derogatory terms, and even terms made up by these white nationalist groups as well. These were derived from a preliminary study of the blogs, a preliminary reading of the different blogs across the three leaders, and this was the set I used within the Luke program to track the backlash. The in-group subcategory was one way to divide these words, and it was essentially a category that included rhetoric that upheld white nationalist ideals and white male superiority over other races, ethnicities, and genders. A separate subcategory was the outgroup subcategory, which I categorized certain words to be generally racist and or hateful that were used to belittle or degrade other races, ethnicities, and genders. Essentially, hate speech against other groups that were not within the white nationalist movement versus the in-group subcategory upheld the white nationalist groups' ideals. Now, tracking arrogance with Luke, I used the Haggard et al. Scale, intellectual humility scale, and then also conceptually supported my tracking of arrogance with the Whitcomb et al. Humility measurement. Using Haggard et al. Measurement, you can see here the different points that were used in his survey-based within Haggard et al.'s survey-based measurement, where it was considering or asking survey participants to answer to these questions whether or not they agreed with these statements. I love learning. I tend to get defensive about my intellectual limitations and weaknesses. When someone points out a mistake in my thinking, I'm quick to admit that I was wrong and things like that. As the scale was at least partially designed for self-reporting, I had to create a modified version to track individual phrases and words that represented white nationalist leaders' display of character traits, as they weren't likely to specifically say, "I'm quick to acknowledge my intellectual limitations" in their blogs. I had to modify this to consider what phrases that may be deemed similar to this scale that could be found within their rhetoric that was produced online. So I came up with this specific scale, which modified it to be a lot shorter, like I love learning, I doubt myself, I'm always certain, I know for a fact, I am not wrong, and essentially created the Haggard et al. Scale into a shifting it from a survey-based scale to a more exploratory search for phrases that aligned with these specific wordings. Now, the results on the hate speech tracking showed a relatively consistent level of hate speech for in-group and out-group subcategories. The range for the average of out-group hate speech ranged from 13% to 19%, and then from 1% to 7% for the in-group categorization. This shows the average percentage of hate speech within all three leaders' blogs within a specific month from 2007 to 2020. So this essentially combined all three leaders' rhetoric into one graph here. Breaking this down, this is actually a consistent pattern across all three leaders and before, during, and after 5 events I was tracking. This consistent level of hate speech, both the in-group hate speech and out-group hate speech, where the relatively the relative trend was that it was a consistent level from 2007 to 2020, even during, before, during, and after these 5 events. As you can see here with Jared Taylor as well, and with Kevin Deanna. Now, the vice of arrogant results were relatively harder to come across. The Luke program actually failed to capture the context and meaning in the multi-word phrases that I designed from the Haggard et al. Scale. So I relied on the meaning extraction help for software program, which was able to actually track the multi-word phrases in the blogs. Of the 3,000 phrases that the program ended up tracking, I selected 10 phrases that stood out that seemed to mirror the modified dictionary of phrases indicative of the vice of arrogance and the virtue of humility. These phrases were I know, you know, expect to, we know, you don't, they don't, we should, I believe the truth, the best. You don't and they don't were abbreviated based on the survey's initial settings. The results here show the cumulative total number of phrases that were found within the blogs within a specific month. So for example, in June, the total number of phrases across all the blogs written in June by all three leaders was around 2 or 3. While these spikes do seem to be rather large, the maximum number of times a phrase appeared within 1 month was 9 times. So relatively low level of presence of these phrases within the blogs of all three leaders from 2007 to 2020. Ultimately, the conclusion from this was specifically that white national leaders did not increasingly use explicitly racist and or hateful political rhetoric in their blogs across the 14-year time period. Also, the white nationalist leaders did not increasingly display the vice of arrogance in their rhetoric across the same time frame. Based on that last graph, it was actually a relatively low level of arrogance across their blogs in the 14-year period. And then lastly, the growth of white nationalism could not be explained by white nationalist backlash against key events of social and political importance within the US. Ultimately, all three hypotheses were not proven. Instead, what I found was that there was a consistent hateful rhetoric level across all three leaders. They consistently expressed racist and hateful rhetoric over the 14-year period and before, during, and after the 5 events. Ultimately, I also found context is important based on the vice of arrogance search. As the programs were limited to extracting phrases, they did not necessarily account for the subject matter that was discussed in the dictionary. The reason why I didn't necessarily dive into the vice of arrogance results was because they did not necessarily indicate instances of arrogance. The "I know," "they know," "we know" kind of phrases, "we should," they weren't necessarily truly indicative of arrogance. This was a limitation of my study, as I found that the the Haggard et al. Modified scale I created um, was essentially more complex than what the software was able to account for. Ultimately, the key takeaways was that it's important to consider members, considering the leaders specifically in their context. Well, considering the members first, because these results point us away from the white nationalist group leaders. Future studies should consider the members of these groups instead, as these leaders showed a consistent level of hate speech and consistent level of explicitly racist rhetoric. Maybe it's individuals that began as inactive or rarely active members of their groups that are more impacted by certain events or more inspired to get involved. Certain key events may motivate them to speak out due to anger or fear towards certain reactions in society, certain changes in society that they deem to be threatening towards their white identity and privileges. Hence, this backlash theory may still apply to these individuals, but it does not apply in this case to these leaders. Also, it's important to incorporate context. Future work should incorporate methods to track the frequency of hate speech words and extract the context meaning of the words. As I was able to track the frequency, it did not help considering the fact that I was not able to consider whether or not those individual phrases were always used as arrogant or derogatory, like essentially arrogant phrases. They weren't essentially always considered to be either. Claims of over-owning one's strengths or under-owning one's limitations. So hand coders can judge the context and scale of phrases. A, fr- uh, a phrase is relative. A phrase's relative arrogance level. Now, ultimate takeaway here was that it may be important to take a step back from looking at the rhetoric. If we understand and recognize that there has been this consistent level of hate speech, what can be done about this hate speech? What can be done in society on a societal level that will counteract it? Currently, there's a huge debate about whether or not hate speech should be covered by free speech. Comparing the US's reaction to the free speech and First Amendment right debate to the EU's debate about hate speech, one can see that the code of conduct on countering illegal hate speech online has actually forced social media places such as Facebook and Instagram to regulate this rhetoric, this racist and hateful rhetoric. In the US, currently does not have a similar code of conduct or law that does the same thing. They have Section 230 of the US's Communications and Decency Act to regulate hate speech, but it's a relatively um, loose law that does not actually necessarily carry out that regulation feature. It's been deemed by some to actually instead protect certain forms of speech under the First Amendment. So, what could be considered here is with this consistent level of hate speech, what can be done on the US's level, and maybe looking at the EU's own model, their own code of conduct, maybe going forward, future laws in the US, as there is a current debate about Section 230 and revamping it. Maybe there could be a way to differentiate this hate speech from free speech, and whether or not that can be covered is still a debate to be talked about. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I appreciate it.